Hey guys, just want to see if I'm broadcasting and stuff here. If you can give me a shout. My name is John Connolly. I live in Salt Lake City, Utah. Uh, this is my first presentation of this kind, so I'm quite nervous. Very nervous to be doing this. I've never done this sort of thing before. I also procrastinated a bit. Hi guys. Um, I'm going to be reading just off my screen, and it is kind of difficult to talk without feedback. I work a lot better with in interactive situations where I'm talking and I'm doing question and answer type sessions. So I'm very uncomfortable doing this sort of thing, but I'm just going to do my best. Um, anyway, here we go. I've not given any public presentation of any sort before, so please forgive me on how basic this is. I don't have any screenshots, video clips, or anything like that. And I don't even know how long this is going to be. This is actually the first time I've read through it. I apologize if it winds up being a little bit on the short side of things. In addition, I admit to procrastinating in my preparations for this. I put it off. George asked me, and I said, yeah, I wanted to build this. I was excited about it. I felt I had a little bit to contribute, but I put it off until the last minute, and I'm a pretty good writer, and I can present topics well, but I work best when I revise, and this one is not revised at all, so it's a bit sloppy. This is my first draft on the topic, and if it's rough, I'm very, very sorry. I'm going to take feedback from this and the questions and answers that take place, and I'll go ahead and include them and try to improve it so that if I do this again, it'll be better for the next time, and also I could even put this in a paper form. I write a lot better than I speak. So my intention is to go through the talk here first and then take a question and answer period afterwards. I will monitor the chat window, and if I see good questions, I'll be interrupted and go ahead and answer them as best I can at the time. My keyboard's kind of loud, so if you hear tapping and stuff like that, I'm sorry. My goal here is to get you guys to thinking about the stuff I'm going to talk about. And I know I'm babbling a lot about what I'm going to do, whatever, but my intention is for you guys to think about this and then take the baton and run with it. Because this stuff that I'm talking about here, consent, is so basic and so simple, yet we take it for granted. And I think we make a lot of mistakes with our assumptions. So let me continue a little bit and tell you a little bit more about who I am. I was a sheep 3 years ago, the one that we all complain about, and I knew something was wrong, but I wasn't sure what it was, and I did everything by the book as far as getting licenses when I was supposed to, permits, and I kept running into situations that made it clear to me that these licensing divisions weren't doing what they claimed to be doing. And unfortunately, I had a problem with that, and made me start thinking about it. I'm the kind of guy that if I see somebody being wronged, even if it's bad for me, I will step in and try to point out when somebody's getting taken advantage of, because I just can't help it. I just can't help myself. And I can't mind my own business in situations like that. I mean, I know what you mean by the whole statist sticking their nose into stuff that's not their business, but I mean blatant wrongdoings. Well, anyhow, in my researches of starting to figure out who I was, I started coming across the free man movement by guys like Robert Menard, and he's Canadian, and it really started to open my eyes as to what was going on. I love his stuff, Robert's stuff, a lot, and I think it's technically correct, but I think its presentation isn't the greatest because it's really hard to understand what he's talking about unless you already know what he's talking about. So actually using what he's saying is very, very difficult. So I tried to get more details and answers as to the things he was talking about, but it seemed to be so cloaked in secrecy that I really couldn't get anywhere very easily. So along the way further, I ran across Jordan Maxwell. Well, if you don't know who Jordan Maxwell is, he's a guy who lives down in LA, and his gig is he studies the use, derivation, and trickery or deception of words and symbols. The trickery and deception is in your face all the time, but 999 out of 1,000 people don't even see it. You know, the whole eye on top of the pyramid and stars and things like that. And that's, you start bringing that stuff up and people talk to you like you're a conspiracy nut, and they start cracking jokes and things like that. So that doesn't go very far because people don't want to recognize that sort of thing. But as far as the deception goes, because of my honor and the fact that I can't see things that are going wrong and not say anything, that the whole deception of really struck a nerve. We're told we're free, but we don't feel that way. I mean, we are free. We are free, but we get trapped. So I had to start somewhere, and I started looking at my own life, questioning everything. Years ago, I was, besides being a complainer, I was a bit of a whiner. I was one of those guys, and the reputation was deserved. You know, me being a whiner, I was always complaining, and when something didn't go my own way, I blamed somebody else or something else for it. It was never my fault. And this kept happening over and over, and about 2 years ago, I started really looking into myself and realizing that the common denominator in all that stuff was me. It wasn't the situations or the other people or anything like that. It was me. And other people didn't complain like that. I did. So why were they not complaining? I realize now that they are mostly clueless, but at least then I was asking the right questions. So I forced myself to face what I was doing. And I realized that all the conflict that I was running into was created by myself. I didn't like the outcomes, but that's not the point. I was actually aware enough to try to figure out what my role was in all the conflict I kept running into. So I started thinking about consent. What is consent? In my studies and self-reflection, this topic kept coming up. And so when George approached me, inviting me to speak for this gig that he and his crew have put together, it didn't take me very long to zero in on consent as a topic, because I feel it's the key to everything that all of us are doing and fighting for. So I started thinking really long and hard about consent. What is consent? I had never thought about it in any depth, but I had to for this topic. So you have to understand, this is going to get rolling here in a minute. I know I'm very, very slow in getting started, but I'm figuring my way through this stuff also, along with you guys. And I don't consider myself an expert on this at all, but I have a pretty good, decent grasp of it, at least better than a lot of people. And it's to the point where I can present it and just get you to start questioning things that are going on. So what is consent? First off, I view consent as a form of a contract. It can be written or non-written. Non-written is usually verbal, or it's simply understood between two or more people. We deal with these situations all the time and are quite familiar with them. Can I kiss you? Excuse me, sir, I am mowing lawns in the neighborhood for $10 each. Do you want me to mow your lawn? I can also do it all summer every week, if you want, or every other week. Another example is, Scott, can I borrow your pickup truck to move my girlfriend's couch? Another one is, hey buddy, if you want to go into this concert, you have to let us pat you down. That's all there is to it. These are obvious consensual situations, but there's a lot of ambiguity in these instances which can lead to problems. This is a true story that I'm about to tell you. When I was in my early 20s, I grew up in Virginia, and I was on a sports team back there. And At an after-game party, one of the guys on my team asked the girlfriend of one of his teammates if he could borrow her car. She said, yeah, sure. She tossed him the keys, and he grabbed his buddy, and he hopped out in the car, and he drove to California. And this is, I swear this is true. And he stayed there for a month. She called the police when she got wind of what had actually happened, because everyone was laughing about it behind her back. And the police interviewed, and they asked her what had happened and whatever. And she said to him, you know, he asked to borrow the car. And I said he could borrow it, and he's not returning it. And the cop asked, did you ask for the car back? She said, no, I can't get a hold of him yet. He's like, well, he's still borrowing the car. You know, I mean, that sounds lame. And he really misrepresented what he was doing, because she assumed that they were going to 7-Eleven to get more beer or something, and they were going to California. But whose fault was it that that they took advantage of her? I mean, they didn't lie. They sort of misrepresented what they were borrowing the car for. But is it their fault or hers for not asking the appropriate questions? And one example is, where are you going with my car, and when will you be back? That could have changed this loaned car to a stolen car for this in this situation, for example. So that is a true story, but this leads into a more enforceable and clear form of consent, which I consider to be a contract. Now, a contract is written, and it's simply an agreement between two or more people with the details spelled out so that the details aren't forgotten. Because if you don't have something written down, it's easy to forget, and we all do it. We forget the details of what we had agreed to. And the advantage of written contracts is they're just a more useful of reminding both sides of the details of the agreement. Since it's written down, there's a lot less he said, she said, and you said, and I never said that. There's none of that stuff, because it's there in black and white. You signed it. But you have to be careful, because you come across these contracts all the time in your lives, and it's getting to the point of ridiculousness with the more common ones, like getting a bank account, cell phone contracts, cable TV, because they're pages and pages long, and they're so long that nobody reads them before they initial and sign all the lines and stuff. They just sign everything and whatever to get their phone. And it's obvious that with most people, convenience takes precedence over these annoying details. But they are agreeing and giving consent to everything on all those pages. They're signing it. And I even remember a couple years ago, there was a company that put a user agreement to pay us $1 million buried in one of the paragraphs of their cell phone contract as a joke. And of course, everyone just went ahead and signed it and whatever. And after they signed it, this was done on TV. They went ahead and showed people that they signed away, you know, a $1 million liability to the cell phone company because they were too lazy to read the pages. Now, the company didn't enforce that. It was just one of these, let's, you know, see if we can get away with this sort of thing. So back to consent. What different kinds of consent are there? So I thought about it for a bit, and there's the kind of consent that you give. That's most of the consent that people think of when they think of what consent is. It simply means, and the short version is, it means I'm okay with this. You either declare it verbally or it's written down in the form of a contract. And then we have the other common form of consent. This is just what I've been running through my head thinking about, which is the unspoken yet understood consent. And we run into this situation throughout the day, all the time when dealing with other people. You go to the grocery store, and there's a lady with 2 grocery bags in her arms standing at the door, and she looks at you. She's asking you to open the door for her. She hasn't said anything. And usually, you know, unless you're a jackass, you go ahead and open the door for her. That's another form. Then we have friendship. And friendship is based in, you know, when you break it down, it's a consensual contract between 2 people. And they agree to hang out together because of a common interest, usually. Sports, agorism, hobby, love. But I started thinking about this a little bit, and I've got 3 kids, 3 young kids. And it's interesting when you watch little kids. because when they start exploring friendship with each other, they're really, really formal. You know, they'll go to the playground, and my boy will walk up to another kid, and he'll say, "Will you be my friend?" It sounds cute. It's really, really formal. But after a little while, they realize that the formality is really unnecessary, and it's just an understanding between people. Because if you don't want to be somebody's friend, you just ignore them. If they're rude, you know, you turn your back on them, you walk away, whatever. You just ignore them, and eventually they'll go away. And then we have group dynamics, which is where things get pretty complicated, where you and your buddies, and I'm talking about a bunch of guys here, you know, watching the football games and things like that. You could have a group of 10 guys, and in the typical group, you'll often have one asshole. And the group tolerates this guy because he's only an asshole 1 out of the 9 times to you. And he's a real jerk, but you can watch him being a jerk to 8 people for the 1 time that he's a jerk to you. And so in the result, the end of that is, you know, you tolerate him. You tolerate him because you end up benefiting more from this guy. You know, he's only a pain once in a while. Now, you do have situations where this guy crosses the line and you confront him, or at least I feel you should, and tell him where the line is and that he crossed it and you're not okay with what he did, or something like that. And most of the time you guys will come to an understanding, and you know, you'll give the man hug and, you know, drink a beer together or shake hands or something, and you guys move on. But then we have another situation here where one of the guys in your group starts dating the sister of one of the other guys in the group. At some point, he could do something to his new girlfriend that would have the guys laughing had it been anybody else except for one of the buddy's sisters. So now it's not funny. You know, it was funny to somebody else, but when it's to one of your group's sisters, it's not funny anymore. If it's bad enough, the group can effectively blackball this guy, which is basically, I view it as a withdrawal of consent to be his friend. And the group is telling him, dude, you crossed the line. What you did was not okay. And in those sort of situations, this guy can leave the group, or he can make amends to the girlfriend and then the group also, and hopefully everything is going to be smoothed over. It's a bigger version of the one-on-one problem. And the same group of guys that you're hanging out with, they could have all sorts of crazy rules. Like, I mean, they could have you chug a beer if a certain word goes on TV, and what you can say and what you can't say. And everybody in the group, for the most part, consents to these rules, and they just go ahead and go along with them. Can somebody else live by your group's rules if they want to? Absolutely. But it doesn't mean they're going to be included in your group, but nobody is stopping them at all. And this sounds like a lot of contract stuff, but I just want to reiterate that a contract is consent by both sides. So in this last example, I've pointed out that consent can be withdrawn at any time. Do you need a reason? No, you don't. But it is critical that you voice or write your objection so that the other side cannot claim you didn't say anything. Because otherwise they could claim that, well, I didn't know. How could I say I'm sorry or make it right if I didn't know something was wrong? The reason is often expected, but in reality, the reason is their problem, because it takes 2 people to have a relationship, and both have to agree to it. Can somebody be your friend without your consent? No. That's all there is to it. What they think and what the reality are can be very different. And in written contracts, usually there are consequences for not fulfilling one end of the deal. If the consequences aren't there, somebody's making a mistake, because you have to have consequences for the contract not being done. So a common example of consent is some guy who's complaining, and he says, you know what, I cannot stand my mother-in-law, but I have to deal with her. And the reality is, no, you don't. This is a situation where I like to view it as you have consent with conditions, so to speak. You love your spouse. It's sort of like the group dynamic with the jerk in the group. You love your spouse, but you put up with the mother-in-law as a condition of the spouse. Nobody's making you do anything at all. If you don't like it, you can leave. Say, you know what, I can't stand your mom so much. I can't take it anymore. I'm getting a divorce. And you can leave. It's possible that the spouse may say, you know what, you're right, my mom is being a real jerk. Let's kick her out of the basement, make her go live somewhere else. I don't want to lose you. And you come to a compromise. And my point is that nobody's making you do anything at all in your life. If you don't like it, you can leave or stop, period. It's consent with baggage or consent with conditions. It's like the jerk in your group that you put up with, even though you don't like it very much, but nobody's making you do anything. You're doing it voluntarily. You do everything voluntarily, everything in your entire life. You have choices all the way. Your life is not mapped out for you. You are making choices, and they're your responsibility. You can stop what you're doing at any time, and there may be consequences for this now or sometime down the road, but nobody's making you do these things. They're your choices. You may be dealing with the consequences of these choices now that you made months or even years ago, like building something for somebody. You promised to help somebody build a garage, and it ended up being way harder than you anticipated. You made the promise, you made the agreement, and nobody made you do that. You know, you did it on your own. And I started trying to think about this stuff, about people complaining about, well, I had to do it. You know, I had to do it. And I can't really think of many situations where you have to do much of anything other than by gunpoint. You know, it's a choice that you have. There are choices that are a lot nicer in the moment than another, like doing the homework you can't stand instead of getting a bad grade, or not learning the topic that you're doing the homework for, or knowing not to go driving the car when you've been drinking. You can drive the car after drinking. It's not wise because there are possible consequences of getting in an accident while drunk. Getting in that same accident while sober is not nearly a big of a deal, but while drinking, there are other issues that you're running into as far as liability. If you're not drunk, you know they can't say you were drunk. So not drinking doesn't mean you're not going to get in that same accident, but the possibilities and consequences are very different from making that choice. And I'm not preaching here on drinking or anything like that. You guys are all adults and like to think that you choose to do everything. At least that's my goal. But I want to point out that everything you do is by your own consent and your choice. So another lame example is if you have an next door neighbor who's elderly, and you know what, you just decide to do the right thing, that you're going to mow their lawn in the summer. But come July, it's 104 degrees out, it's been that way for 2 weeks, and you really don't want to do it, you can just stop mowing it. You can quit for the rest of the summer. Nobody's making you do this. You just get sick of it. A lot of people and your spouse may think you're a real douchebag for doing that sort of thing, but it is your choice, and you're the one out there mowing it, not them. So somebody can stop associating with somebody else whenever they feel like it. That's consent in a nutshell. I got a question here to explain the difference in liability whether drunk or sober. I'm hardly an expert on this sort of stuff, but I like to think of liability as you have the common law people, of which I am one. I haven't brought any of that stuff up in here yet, but will claim that you have an obligation and a duty not to harm other people. And by driving drunk, you are, I don't want to say breaching the duty, but you're really kind of crossing the line on what's being okay or not. And the consequences are going to be harder if you're drunk than if you're sober. Anybody can get in an accident when they're sober without the excuses. Hang on, I got an interruption here. Hey, you guys got to go upstairs.
Where's Sasha?
Go upstairs, please.
I'm looking for Sasha.
My 5-year-old. Buddy, go upstairs. Thank you. Close the door, please. I'll try to get to that in a little bit because I have to wrap my head around it a little bit. But as far as consent goes, we start getting into other contracts like driver's license, concealed carry permits, etc. And those are all forms of contracts. I personally am one of those fringe guys that do not need. I believe we don't need licenses or permits to do anything like that. I believe that my obligation is not to harm anyone or their property. The damages aren't greater whether you're drunk or sober, but you breached your obligation to not harm others when you chose to drive drunk. Is I guess my point. You breached if you're drunk, somebody could argue that you wouldn't have gotten in an accident had you not been drunk. If you weren't drunk, they can't make that argument. So the damages are probably going to be different in the two situations, because when you're drunk, you are now you breached your personal responsibility not to harm others. Just because you drove drunk and got home safe, I personally feel that somebody should be able to get drunk and drive home if they want. They are accepting the liability of that decision. I don't touch alcohol myself, but I think that if somebody wants to go ahead and do that sort of thing, that's their business. But they are making a known choice to do something that puts others at risk by doing that, and they therefore accept the liability of that. And somebody could claim that by driving drunk they would have gotten in an accident that they would not have gotten in had they been sober. And so you've injured somebody, sort of knowingly. But anyhow, back to my my topic here, as far as driver's licenses and things like that. You do not need. I feel you don't need a license or a permit in order to do a lot of those things. And the reality of the situation is, if you choose to get one of those things, those statist licenses or whatever, you, in a nutshell, you're signing on that line and you're agreeing to terms and conditions in return for getting the license or the permit. It's spelled out somewhere on the DMV contract or wherever, and you're agreeing to those terms when you signed it as a condition. It's part of the contract. And if you don't like the terms and conditions, why did you sign it? If you found out later that you had signed something that you didn't like the terms and conditions because they were kind of hidden to you, or you were asleep or something like that, which is what happened to me, why did you not turn the license back in and revoke consent on this contract? You can choose to do this at any time. So what is stopping you? The fact that some banks won't let you cash your check without a driver's license or another form of state ID is another problem. It's another matter. That's a condition, for example, that may cause you to get your driver's license. But even state IDs have conditions, not unlike driver's licenses. But where people start to get kind of confused, and the stuff that I'm talking about here, is where I point out that you can take advantage of having driver's license or state ID whenever you feel like it, and you can choose not to have it or disclose it in other situations. You can choose when you're taking advantage of having the benefits of having a driver's license or an identification. You pick and choose when you want it, anytime you want. And this is a form of consenting when to use it or not to. Nobody says you have to use your ID or driver's license, even if you have one. And then we have situations of contracts. I know this is a little scattered, I'm sorry. Either written or verbal. You do not have to follow through on them. You have contracts with people, and you don't have to follow through on them. Nobody's making you. But remember, if these things are done properly, there are consequences for you not fulfilling your end of the deal. Yeah, that's a good point, Dan. Dan says that totally sober people cause terrible accidents. They're either not paying attention, they're talking on a cell phone, they're driving too fast. There's all kinds of things. So accidents are caused both ways. But have you guys ever considered that a written contract is not enforceable in most cases? And I know a lot of you are saying, what are you talking about? How can it not be enforceable? Well, here's an example. You and I have entered a contract. I went over to your house, and agreed to plow your driveway. You got a long driveway, and I plowed it. I agreed to plow it for the whole winter for $500. You and me sat down in your kitchen, and we signed the paper. $500. Gave me $500 cash, and out I go. So this winter, it's been snowing like crazy. My truck breaks down. My wife leaves me, and my life generally sucks. And I'm not plowing your driveway. I got too much stuff going on. I just don't feel like it. And I spent the money on a jet ski back in August anyway. So the money's gone. And you're really, really mad. You make demands, and I continue to say, no, you're fed up, and you take me to court. So we get in front of the judge, and you present the contract as evidence, right? Prove that's my signature. You can't. Think about it. You cannot prove that's my signature. I don't have to deny anything, since I don't have to provide you with any evidence, should I choose not to. In other words, testify against myself. Because we all know that I don't have to testify against myself, and I cannot be compelled to do so. And you cannot prove that is my signature. And by that alone, I have withdrawn consent, and the contract does not exist. Now, I'm not saying that we should all go out and start taking advantage of others in this way, even though you could. But what I'm trying to point out is that contracts are ultimately unenforceable if you're really thinking things through and paying attention. An exception to this sort of situation is if you have a contract with witnesses, like in front of a notary or some other witnesses or whatever, because they saw you sign the contract and you're locked in and, you know, tough, plow the guy's driveway. And none of this has anything to do with doing the right thing or whatever. I'm just pointing out that even in cases like this, even when I still have to consent to it, even after I have signed the contract. Now that sounds kind of crazy that, you know, you consented once, but you can withdraw consent on the same thing later. But I want you to think about this, because consent can be withdrawn at any time. Now that has nothing to do with the consequences. I'm not discussing the consequences because that's something that you need to have in your documentation or whatever. But for example, if a credit card charge comes in for something that you didn't buy, and you see this, you're like, what the heck? Somebody bought something in Los Angeles. They bought a bicycle. You know, they got your credit card. You know, you can test it. And they say, well, it's yours. You know, and you say, prove it was me. And in fact, even if you did buy that bicycle, they can't prove it was you, because a simple prove that was my signature will stop them in their tracks. They can't prove that was your signature. They can't do it. There are consequences for doing this, because if you did that to me and we all know you signed the contract, I'm going to tell everybody what a douchebag you are. And you may not care, but there may be consequences for doing it, because, you know, my mom may know your mom or something like that, but you did this and you chose to face them, both known and unknown, when you did it. And so you're faced with these choices continually. I'm asked here, am I a taxpayer? We could talk about this for hours. I could say prove that I'm a taxpayer, because the term taxpayer has been redefined, and I suggest you read the definition of a taxpayer. Instead of assuming or saying that I am or am not, I would make you prove that I am, because taxpayer is a term that has been redefined, and you need to read the code and see what it says. And instead of asking whether you are or are not, you should be asking them to prove that you are. Because I think that answering questions is only going to get you in trouble, or answering questions rather. I think you should be volleying the ball back across the net to their side until they get too frustrated and they just find somebody who's easier pickings. But I want to tell another story of mine that happened to me several years ago before I knew better. This is another true story. We had a fence on one side of our property, and one morning a kid was driving his dad's pickup truck, and rounding a corner, his big gulp spilled, and he leaned over to pick it up, and he swerved the truck and crashed right through our fence. And I heard the boom. It was early in the morning. I grabbed the camera and ran outside and took a bunch of pictures and stuff like that. And he called his dad, and his dad came right on over. And Dad was really, really apologetic. He seemed like a really nice guy. Furthermore, he was in the construction business, and he said to me, I'm going to fix it better than you. And this was a great situation, no hassle. So I agreed to it. We shook hands, done. And he started doing this, and he tore out the old damaged sections and hauled them off for disposal. When he started getting ready to put things together, I got the impression, the real feeling, the guy really didn't know what he was doing. Sure, he was in the construction business, but so was almost everybody else. And so I told him, you know what, I'm not comfortable with this. I need you to stop. So my wife and I got 4 estimates from fence companies, and in the end, we decided to have one of the fence companies, one of the middle estimates, of course, do the repair instead. And so in other words, I revoked consent to Mr. Fence Crasher, and he was really, really angry. And he was so angry that he refused to pay the bill when I submitted it to him. And his argument was, why should I pay $1,200 for something I could have done myself in a couple days? And I mean, I can understand where he's coming from, but I think we all agree that this is not a decision that was his to make because it was our fence, not his. So what ended up happening was he refused, and I had to take him to court. And understand that at this time, I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I was just Joe Schmo. And court date came across, and we sat there for a while, and then we sat in front of the judge, and so I presented my case. And the fence crasher guy butts in with the whole "I was fixing it" line, and he stopped letting me fix it and brought these fence guys in, and the judge says it's not your fence to decide on. So that was out on his part, and so I was done with my side. So he presents his case, and the first thing he did was he enters into evidence a bill from the county dump for $202 for dumping off the old fence. And of course, he hands it to me for review, and I looked at it. I really didn't kind of know what I was looking at, whatever. I was scared in front of the judge and stuff like that, and so looked at it for a few seconds, and I handed it back, and I said, yeah, I thought to myself, this looks like a receipt. So I handed it back to him. And the long story short in this is what ended up happening was the judge found for our $1,200, but he subtracted the $200 for the dump fee. And without getting into the details as to there being no way the dump fee was actually $200 for that small section of fence, I was the one that sat there silently while he presented the evidence, and I did not object to it. In fact, that receipt could have been for anything. It could have been for a load of old concrete from a pool or patio demolition, but I consented to the entry of this evidence, to this presentation of the evidence, by not saying anything. And after the verdict, I couldn't even see straight. I was so angry, and I was sure that the judge and the fence buster guy screwed me and my wife. And it wasn't until about actually 6 months ago, when I started thinking about this topic, I started realizing where my error was and who was at fault. I was at fault. It was my fault that I allowed this BS receipt to be entered into evidence. I should have objected to it, and whether or not it was legitimate or not had nothing to do with it, because I sat there and I allowed it to be entered into evidence. And the judge ruled based on the evidence that was presented. The judge did nothing wrong. And it's important to note at this time that even though this is off topic, that the judge in the court they're not finders of truth. They rule based on the evidence presented, not necessarily truth. So you can have things that are true that are not allowed into evidence, and they cannot rule on those. So just because it's true doesn't mean it's going to be entered. And that's exactly what this judge did in my situation. And for years later, I stewed about it, and it was only about 6 months ago I realized it was my own fault, and I was the one that allowed this guy to enter it by not saying something. And by not saying something, I consented to it. And so now that that story is out of the way, I'll get back on track with my last form of consent that has occurred to me, which is assumed consent. And by assumed, I mean it's not really given freely, it's sort of taken. An example of this is where, this is a really primitive example, but you're at the supermarket checkout line and a guy with a gallon of milk cuts in front of your cart. 40 items. You've got 40 items in your cart, he's got one thing of milk, and he just cuts right in front of you. And you think to yourself, he's got one thing, I'm just going to let it slide. And he could have asked, he didn't, and you could have made a big deal about this, and you chose not to. That's an example. Or how about when you're dating somebody, and on the fourth date, you like her a lot, and you're walking from the movie theater or something out, and you reach out and grab her hand while you're walking. If she clasps your hand, it's probably okay that you grabbed her hand. If she had all of a sudden had to tie her shoe or forgotten something back in the movie theater and pulled her hand out of yours, then obviously the consent was not given. It's up to the other party to decide what to do, to consent or not to consent. So what forms of non-consent do we have? We have no, I do not consent, or I'm not okay with that. She pulls her hand away. And these are the forms of consent that I think that we have the most trouble with, because we're treading on gray areas here. And when you're dealing with forced consent, you're faced with the decision on the spur of the moment, and you don't have any real time to make this decision or reflect on it. And so I think this is the area where we get into trouble with most of the time. And this is also the area where I feel we are continually taken advantage of. Usually the other side, by assuming consent, is convinced a lot of times that they already have the consent, or in the case of statists and police, they don't need the consent. You know, they're powerful for whatever reason, and they feel entitled to be doing what they're doing, and so they're going to do it. And an example of this is a traffic stop. Now, I like to think that most of you guys are aware, like I talked about before, that you don't have to testify against yourselves. And that means you don't have to answer any questions. And there are probably consequences of that, especially with the attitudes and behaviors of many of these bad guy cops. So a cop pulls you over and asks for your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. And note that normally when these guys do this sort of stuff, they ask you for this stuff. So is he asking you, or is he ordering you? If he's asking you, then you can say no, right? And if you do this, I mean, understand that there are consequences for doing this sort of stuff, because these guys are asking, but they're not asking. And these areas, you know, the stuff that we're talking about here at this point is these assumptions have crept in for decades. And we make assumptions, and the cops assume even more. But almost nobody asks the police if it's a request or an order. And to me, and to most reasonable people, that's a pretty darn good question. And if it ever came down to it, for example, in court or something like that, in a lawsuit or something like that, no reasonable individual is going to see anything wrong with asking clarifying questions, especially one that is asked to clarify what's expected of them. Like that girl who loaned the car to who drove the car to the guy who drove to California. You know, it was her fault she didn't ask the questions. So in traffic stops, most of the things that occur there are examples of consent. I hear a lot of people complain about illegal traffic stops, and you know, this traffic stop is illegal and stuff like that. And I used to actually make those same complaints, but I've started thinking about it and whatever, and there's nothing wrong with a cop asking anything they want if it's a request. It's been, hey, you have to leave, buddy. Thanks. He likes being on TV. It's been ruled, actually, that a cop can, in fact, lie to you. And they have a license to lie to get you to say things that are going to get you in trouble. And when you... Thank you, George. So when you get right down to it, the questions that keep coming up, and the ones that you should be asking, or at a bare minimum you've probably seen a lot of, are things like, am I being detained? If yes, on what grounds am I being detained, and am I free to go? And a lot of times the officer will trick you by restating these questions. You know, for example, you can say to him, am I being detained? And the cop will say, well, we just want to ask you a few questions. And notice when he says that, he didn't answer your question. So you'll just sit there and continue to answer questions over and over instead of re-asking if you're being detained. So he avoided your question deftly, and I'm sure they're trained to do this sort of stuff. And if somebody assumes consent and the other party doesn't object to it, then most people reasonably assume that consent is granted. And that's where the whole silence is consent thing comes in. And that sort of, you really, really have to be aware of that sort of thing. The silence and consent. If you're not okay with something, you really need to say something or express that you're not okay with it. You have to have a protest noted. So in the normal traffic stop situation is you just sit there and you start answering questions, trying to talk your way out of the trouble you don't even know you're in. And it's usually because you weren't doing anything wrong. And you assume that when a cop says, we want to ask you a few questions, that's detention. But they're asking you, they're saying, we want to ask you a few questions. And if you did not object to that, you consented to it, as far as he's concerned. And it's not the cop's fault that you don't know this stuff. Your ignorance is your problem, not his problem. And if you dig around a bit, you'll hear from people that describe situations like this all the time. DA busts into the house with a search warrant. They pull a guy aside and say, we want you to come down to the station and answer some questions. So the guy hops in the cop car voluntarily and answers questions for hours on end. You never hear of people asking, is that an order or a request? Or they put the subject or person of interest in the back seat of the squad car with his hands cupped behind his back with two cops on either side peppering him with questions. And it comes up into court, and the cops will say, we were just asking him questions. He could have left any time. And the way of thinking about that situation is the police have assumed consent because you didn't say anything against that sort of thing. And if you stop for the cop and they ask questions and you have to answer them, what's really going on? And the reality is you don't have to answer any questions. Who is this guy? I mean, this cop, is it a cop? I'm asking you, is it a cop? I mean, it looks like a cop, but is it one? Have you asked him for his ID? You can claim you thought that he was impersonating a cop if he doesn't present proper ID. And if he just states his name, like Officer Reynolds, you can ask him if he's, if when he asks you your name, if you ask him if Mr. Smith is good enough. And that's going to really make him mad because, if it's not good enough for him, why should it be good enough for you? He's expecting an actual ID, an actual piece of paper, a license or something like that. And you have to remember that anything you say can and will be used against you, and that means anything. And since you don't have to testify against yourself, you have a right to not say something. But it feels really uncomfortable. We've been conditioned to answer questions, to reply, to explain why we did things. And you also should know, and you probably do know, that sitting there silently not answering his questions is going to escalate things, probably due to that non-cooperation angle that those guys love to use. And but one angle is, one thing you can ask him is, am I required to cooperate with you? It sounds like a smart-ass answer or a statement, but it's a valid question. If he says, yes, you're going to have to cooperate with me, ask for proof. What statute or law says that I have to cooperate with you? Show me and I will, no problem. And so you basically volley the situation back in his court. But you basically have this delicate situation that you don't want to escalate. And I really think that you can handle this sort of thing appropriately by asking a lot of the right questions. And you do that by making them fail to provide proof by asking these right questions. And I'm not being a smartass, but you have to be honest and honorable and logical. And it's not something really to go into too much detail here, but I just want to point out there are a lot of nonverbal assumptions of consent that we give when being questioned or detained. And tasers and guns come out, that is true, but I'll get to that in a minute. And another example of this is in court during pleadings when they ask, do you understand the charges? Do you plead guilty or not guilty? And most do not realize when they're asking this question that the question is not, do you guilty or not guilty, or do you understand the charges? it's one of jurisdiction or consent. And when you plead anything, you grant jurisdiction along with the pleading. You're saying, I'm guilty or not guilty, or I'm not guilty, which is basically saying, I'm not guilty, but I want you to decide whether I'm guilty or not. It's a consent thing. And there are many options to you in those sort of situations, in the common law road, but it's too broad to complex, especially with only 5 minutes left. But in this sort of situation, you're assuming there are only two options, which is pleading guilty and pleading not guilty, or which lawyer do I get? And there are a lot of other options that you have available to you, and your ignorance is not their fault nor their problem. It's your problem. They're assuming jurisdiction, and in the process of assuming jurisdiction, there are a lot of ways out along the way. And if you choose not to act on these sort of things and question the jurisdiction, it is assumed. So I think the biggest problem faced by a lot of our friends here are that people are not asking any questions. They're assuming the role of the servant. And there's a saying that's really appropriate here, whereas the master asks the questions and the servant answers them. And I feel that asking the right questions is a form of non-confrontational non-consent. If you just sit there silently, you're just going to piss off the cops. And I got a question here. Isn't opening the door with the cops at the door consent? Absolutely. In other words, ending the conversation and closing the door prematurely might lead them towards a probable cause. Well, probable cause for what? People shut their door on people all the time, and a lot of another hour. Sounds like I got nobody after me, but so we'll have maybe an interesting question and answer period after this, because I'm almost at the end of the text that I'm reading, which gets kind of scattered because I was rushing putting it together, and I'm sorry about that. But it's very interesting. The speaker prior to me brought up the discussion of consensual government because that's exactly what I'm referring about. You can choose to consent to some of the taxes and not to others that you choose not to use, for example. Now, most people think it's an all or none package, and they've never even questioned the fact that, why the heck should I do the trash service? I don't have any trash. I recycle everything. I don't have any trash. I have a huge compost thing, and I don't use the trash, so why should I pay for it? And I've read the codes and statutes, at least in my area, after I read Robert Menard talking about it. And I looked up the statutes, for example, and they're written in legalese, which is a language which is not English. It reads like English, but it is not English. And you have to really, really look at the definitions of the words being used in those statutes. They'll ask you, if the statute applies to you, or they'll just assume that it applies to you. The example we run into is they assume that it applies to you, and if you don't say something, it applies to you. They assumed consent, and you did not protest it, you did not turn it around or anything like that, so it is granted. And you have to learn to answer, or to ask questions and stop answering them. And you shouldn't answer any questions. You can turn these questions around and make them prove everything. You shouldn't even, even stating your name is testifying, and you're getting yourself into trouble. If they say that you're this person, what proof do they have that that's you? Usually people just walk right up to the guillotine and stick their head in it. It doesn't make any sense. But they're conditioned to answer questions, and their ego and their pride get in the way. And they'll say, like in my case, are you John Connolly? Well, of course I'm John Connolly. Yes. And I've gotten myself into trouble. I've said that I'm this person now, and they can't prove that I'm me without my consent. It sounds really crazy that they can't prove that you're you, but really they can't do that. They rely on your you hang yourself. You you say something and you start answering questions, and the other problem you run into by answering questions is you think you're answering one question, yet they're answering something else. And again, that goes into the whole legalese and what are they asking? By the redefinition of words from English into legal, you get yourself in trouble. And again, I'm not an expert on this stuff. I'm just trying to give you things to think about on this sort of stuff. I ran pretty late here, but are there any questions at this point that that I can try to answer or think about? I'm looking, I don't see anything here. But it really is important to understand. I mean, you shouldn't be answering any questions. Answering a question from the other side in front of court is providing them with evidence, and you don't have to testify against yourself. So don't answer the questions, but people feel obligated to do that sort of thing. If you answer a question, that's your own fault. I mean, you don't have to answer a question. Because by answering a question, you're giving the other side evidence to use against you. If they ask you any question, you can turn it around. Ask for proof. Are you the person in this picture? Well, prove that I'm the person in the picture. Are you John Connolly? Prove that I'm John Connolly. Why? You don't have to answer anything because they say that anything will be used against you. And you don't have to testify against yourself. Why are you giving them? Because anything you say is going to be used against you, you don't have to say anything. So don't answer the question. Why answer it? They have nothing unless you give it to them. And it sounds really crazy. And they may try to move on, but if you let them move on without stopping them, courts do this sort of stuff all the time. They don't have anything, and well, we're going to move forward here. And if you don't say anything, they're going to move forward. You consented to it. Again, that's another situation. You can say, well, wait a second. Why are we moving forward? We haven't established jurisdiction. Where's the jurisdiction? Where's we have a comment here. Many people think if you refuse consent to search, that in itself gives probable cause to assume that you have something illegal. Can you address this concern? I don't see how that would be the case. But if a cop, for example, pulls you over and pulls you out of the car and is talking to you and stuff like that and says, can I search your car or something like that, and if you don't answer him, or if he cracks the door open and you don't say something or whatever, a lot of people would argue that the state is going to argue that you gave consent by not protesting or by not saying, well, what are you doing? And that's a case where I feel you're continually tested on your knowledge of your rights. And there's an expression that, a right not known or not defended is a right lost. And it's perfectly true, because if you get a guy who doesn't know his rights whatsoever and he gets pulled over and the cop says, well, I'm going to look in your car here and check for drugs. And if the guy just sits there and they search his car, well, that's his fault. It's the guy's fault. And I'm not a cop fan by any means, but the cops are trying to get away with what they can. And if you don't know your rights and you don't know what they're doing is a violation of your rights, then I guess you never had the right to begin with. So, you really have to know what the heck you're doing and know what your rights are. And when you're being stepped on, you need to clarify where that line is, because people make mistakes, and they may not have realized. Most of the time they do realize, but often they don't realize that they're crossing a line, a consensual line. Like with the traffic stops or something like that. We see those guys on the 4409 crew down in Arizona have a bunch of great videos on those unlawful traffic stops that they have, the supposed alien checkpoints down there, and those things are great. And they're absolutely great because they're peppered with questions all the time. You know, the checkpoint guy will ask them, you know, where are you going? What is your business here? And the guy just either sits there or asks the questions back. You know, what are you doing? Where do you live? Where are you going? What are you doing after work? And it shows the ridiculousness of the questions that they're being asked. And usually they get so frustrated and whatever, they just kind of wave the guy on. Or when a traffic stop guy says, pull you over, have you been drinking tonight, stuff like that, and he feels there's something to go ahead and find, and so he says, we'd like you to pull over here to secondary, for some more questioning or something like that. Well, note that we would like you to is a form of a request. It is not an order, and you do not have to go ahead and do that sort of thing. But most people just go ahead and pull right on and over. They don't want to cause problems. They think that if they bow down to Caesar and be a good little slave, that their problems are going to be lessened and go away, and it's not like that at all. But at some point, you have to know where your rights are, and you need to stand up for them. And I think the easiest way to do that in the situations of these guys is to ask for proof for everything, and not necessarily in the courtroom, but you can stop it well before that. For example, when if a cop asks any question, for example, for a driver's license or whatever, you could ask him, well, am I required to have one? And of course he will bluster and say, yes, you are. And we say, well, can you show me the law that says I'm supposed to have it? Just show me the law. If you have a law that says I will do that, absolutely I will show it to you, but I'd like to see the law. And they'll bluster and whatever and go back and pretend to do things and whatever, but ultimately when you put the ball in their court and you make them provide proof for these assertions that they're making, they realize that they don't have it, because they've been making assumptions all along, and they don't. I mean, they may or may not know the book. They may look in the book, and they may find a law that says you have to do such and stuff, and then you can ask them, well, do you have proof that that law applies to me? And again, they're gonna be taken aback there, and they're gonna say, what do you mean proof? This applies to everybody. Well, does it? I mean, I've read the statutes, and I know that they don't apply to everybody. But by questioning them at this time, whatever, it's going to give you an out. It's going to give ammunition down the road in order to defend yourself properly. But I guess I don't have a whole lot more else to say here. I'm seeing a thing here. What about border checkpoints? I'm not an expert on that stuff, but I know that when guys ask you questions, you don't have to answer them. They can pretend you do, but you don't. And I'm also reading here from Ian. Where we go here? I mean, Seth asks, it'd be nice if I could clarify what particular scenario these strategies are good for. So most of these deal with police encounters outside the courtroom, and I haven't thought about this sort of stuff. I knew I only had an hour to deal with to really kind of put this together, and it was a little bit rushed and whatever. But most of this talk was intended to be one of just realizing that you give consent everywhere in everything that you're doing, and you should be questioning every single thing you do in these interactions with these guys, because you have choices, and don't assume anything. I mean, I know that that when you start questioning these guys and whatever, you start running the risk of getting a beat down and getting tased, and them hauling your car off and stuff like that, and it's going to be hard, but the start of learning how to combat these guys is to be asking a lot of questions. When you ask, if you can ask questions, you can frustrate these guys so much by continuing to ask questions that they have to then turn and respond to. And if you ask the questions in a way that they have to provide evidence for it, in many cases they will realize that they don't have the stuff that they think they do. And the fact of this whole thing is, what you're making them realize, the long version, the short version of this is not who's right and who's wrong and whatever, but you're going to be a lot more trouble for these guys than you're worth, and they're going to send you down the road in order to find somebody who's going to sign the ticket real fast and pay the fine without even going to court. So, you know, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and if you're more trouble than the next guy, or you're going to be a real problem guy to them, and not problem guy in terms of being violent or anything like that, but more trouble than, literally more trouble than you are worth, you know, they're going to move on, and they're going to find easier prey. And eventually, hopefully, this sort of stuff, you know, is going to continue on, because I don't think that people right now, the majority of the population, they question nothing. They really don't. They don't question anything at all. They assume that police are doing a job and they're keeping them safe, and they've never even questioned anything other than that. And I know for a fact that I mean, this is kind of personal knowledge, but my wife is going, she used to be one of those, and she's due to some circumstances that are going on in her family that she has nothing to do with, she's seeing the rigged game. And I feel sorry for her, and I feel sorry for her family, but in turn she's starting to actually listen to some of the things that I talk about and think. And I don't even preach to her, because I come off as being, to the mainstream people, a lot of what I'm saying here makes a lot of sense to you guys because you guys have a clue. But when dealing with the mainstream sheep, we're nutcases, and they confuse truth with fact, and you know, they watch these TV shows on things that happen in court, for example, and they assume that that's how everything works. And you know, I've seen a lot of other strategies in court that go on, and you know, there's some pretty obvious things that have been overlooked and whatever. But you know, that's probably a topic for another day. But are there any other questions, guys? On yeah, Charles makes a good point here. He says the lesson here is, when dealing with the authoritarian thugs, is to avoid going into auto-slave mode, and I completely agree with that. Dan Gold says, Judge, am I entitled to ask questions pertaining to complaints against me and to receive responsive answers? That's correct also. You start asking questions. For example, if you went into court, let's say you go into court, and they say, you know, you've been charged with such and such. Do you understand the charge? Well, again, not trying to get off track here about the meaning of the word understand, as in stand under or submit to. You know, do you understand the nature of the charges? You can stonewall these guys to death. Close the door, please. You can stonewall these guys to death by asking questions. Well, you know, it's interesting you bring that up, Your Honor. No, I don't understand the questions. Exactly which statute am I being charged with? And they'll read the statute off. And you can ask, well, is that in English or legal speak? And they'll say, well, that's legal. Well, I don't speak legal, I speak English. What are the legal definitions of all the words in this statute? And, you know, I can't understand a foreign language like this, so I'd like to know what this word means. I'd like to know what this word means. I'd like to know what this word means. And you're costing these guys $1,000 an hour while you're asking these questions. And they're going to get really angry, but you can just ask them, well, you asked if I understood the charges, And I said no, and I'm trying to understand them. So, are you not going to help me understand the charges? And so you're basically putting the ball in their court. Um, and, um, so, I mean, you could be in there for, after you went through the whole statute and you got all these words and definitions of all the words that they're using, they'll ask you, well, do you understand it now? And, well, the question you could ask is, well, does that apply to me? What proof do you have that this applies to me? Because they'll say, well, aren't you this person? And, well, am I? As soon as you answer a question, you're giving them evidence, and they're gonna string you up. You're gonna be toast if you start answering their questions like that. So don't answer them. But you can not answer them and not come across. I mean, go ahead and play stupid. Play stupid because everyone feels sorry for the stupid guy. So play stupid. Don't come across as a really smart, intelligent, bucking the system kind of guy. Be like Goober and question absolutely everything. I'm sorry, Judge. I'm not real smart. I just don't understand. I don't understand what this means. And remember, you're costing them a lot of money by you taking up all this time. And eventually, they're gonna get you out of there because you're not worth the time that you are taking to move through this stuff. And that's another way that you can go ahead and deal with this sort of stuff. Ran over a little bit here, guys. And do I have any further questions? I apologize that I was kind of scattered and stuff, and I'll try to go in and clean this stuff up. I enjoyed this. I felt a little bit more comfortable at the end than I did at the beginning, that's for sure. I think that what George and those guys are doing is absolutely fantastic, and I'm really, really looking forward to looking to some of the other speakers. I was working most of today, and I'm looking forward to looking to these videos and hopefully the archives and watching some of these other people. If we don't have any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this thing up. Thank you very, very much for putting up with me, and wish you guys all the best. Thanks a lot.